Fully automated case-based luxury communism.
There is only one path forward, and it is the path of fully automated gay space luxury communism. Simple. Done. You're welcome. Or not quite. There is no such thing as an easy path, or at least not any path worth walking. What I am proposing is no less than a multi-generational project, but one that must be earnestly begun. This will not be a full accounting of how to achieve these goals or a map forward in any pragmatic sense. Instead, what I want to offer is a sketch, something on which to project and build to allow for the imagination of the possible. And a better future is possible. But what does this cliche mean? And why would anyone fall for this nonsense?
Chapter 1. Fully automated, not full automation.
Let's be blunt. Humans are terrible at macro planning. It is beyond the reach of any individual or group of individuals, no matter how bright, to fully comprehend, predict, and direct the productive capacity of billions, let alone millions or hundreds or tens or even just thousands of people. It is no stretch to say that famines are man-made, that they are not the result of natural occurrences, that they are the result of failure of planning and imagination. Inefficiencies in systems become more pronounced and dangerous when they come under pressure. They build on each other, they connect and fissure deeper. Supply chains break down, connections become tenuous, support systems become ephemeral. Our poor ability to comprehend more than our immediate surroundings is why we have bubbles. Tulips, real estate, railroads, beanie babies, subprime auto loans, Bitcoin, junk bonds. The boom and bust cycle is not just a part of capitalism, it is the very reason that capitalism functions. Back to the subject at hand, fully automated. Now I want to be clear that this does not mean full automation, and I want to draw a firm distinction here. Automation in this case is being used to refer to job replacement, the shifting of productive burden from human to machine, be it a physical robot or an algorithm. Automation is necessarily a function of the drive of capital. It brings down the cost of production and allows for better margins. It creates more value to be extracted and exploited, but under the present system, this value does not feed the larger economy. Rather, it feeds only the small privileged sections of our economy. But this is not an aberration. Capitalism is a rabid beast who eats its own children, so of course the immediate target of automation will be the laborers who built the conditions that allow for the creation, demand, and deployment of automation on a global scale. You can't build steel robots without foundries, you can't have foundries without mines, you can't have iPhones without engineers, you can't have quantum computers without an assembly line. And yet, the adoption of this technology directly serves to displace the very professions that develop this technology. I've heard that some large corporations tell their employees, your job is to eliminate your own job. That is not to say that each employee is trying to get themselves fired. It is to say that in order to advance, you can't simply find someone to take over that job while you move up. Your job is to create a process that you oversee and that exponentially expands your productive capability. One of you is good, but one of you that can program 10 brains just as smart as you and 10 times cheaper is even better. And there we first meet the problem with full automation. As we increase productive capacity, we quickly dwindle the need for human workers. There's only so much that needs to be produced. There's only so much that can physically be consumed. While the world has 7.5 billion people, it is a minority that consumes the majority of goods. If for a second we imagine that every person on Earth consumed like they lived at the top of the developed world, we would be past the limits of sustainability rather quickly. And even without full consumption, we throw out a significant percentage of what we produce. Sometimes it will just be outright destroyed, because the only possible way to salvage capital is through the forced liquidation of otherwise usable goods. In a balanced world, the prevalence of advanced degree holders would lead to more employment opportunities for those people. Succinctly, you wouldn't have PhDs putting in job applications at Costco. This is obviously not the trend. Millennials, loosely defined here as the birth cohort from 1981 to 2000, are the most educated generation in America's history, and yet they are also the victims of lower earnings, higher debt, more job insecurity, and rising costs. I'm not going to go through the litany of statistics right now, but I'll take it as given that you've read a think piece or two about the, quote, millennial. On Monday, February 5, 2018, the Dow Jones experienced its largest one-day loss. It bottomed at negative 1,597 points and closed the day down 1,175 points. What prompted this fall was nothing more or less than an indication that for the first time since the 2008 crash, average wages were beginning to rise. This would generally be positively received by everyone earning these wages, but for the gambling floor that is our macroeconomic reality, this was a sign that there was trouble on the horizon. Rising wages means rising inflation. Rising inflation means a rise in the Federal Reserve's benchmark rate and the end of quantitative easing. That means loans cost more, and worst of all, it would no longer be possible to leverage this cheap cash to buy back corporate stocks and bonds to keep the price high for shareholders and executives. If the system is slightly less rigged, then the profit seems to disappear, and that drives to the heart of the problem. If the only way that relatively modest gains can be pulled out of the economy now is if the entire system is rigged to benefit the richest, then is it really a system worth keeping? To circle back, the same forces of profit and capital that drive the stock market to tank on good news for workers are also the reason that full automation in the market will mean total displacement of the workforce. If you teach a robot to fish, do all people eat or do all people starve? Under the brutality of capital, the vast majority starve while the slimmest minority feast. It's the failure to plan or understand or efficiently spread value that leads us to this precipice. When I say fully automated, I'm fully endorsing that the central planners of the macroeconomy should be minds of silicon. Big data is not just a fun buzzword that I stole from Planet Money, it is also a reality. And a reality that we're failing to exploit in any worthwhile sense. Imagine the difference between the government that we have now and one that has access to the wealth of data that a population of 350 million people creates on a second-by-second basis. Target is able to predict when a woman is pregnant before she even knows, and therein lies the problem. Not the prediction, I mean honestly that's kind of amazing, but the fact that such predictive powers rest in the hands of private capital. Instead of tracking disease, migration, climate patterns, cultural trends, or any other reality for actual people, and using these predictions to inform governance, spending, and policy, the ownership of our data has been given over to the likes of Facebook, Palantir, and Amazon. If to risk techno-evangelizing for a moment, I have to admire the incredible efficiency of the monstrosity that Jeff Bezos has built. An empire sprawling across the globe, reliant on cheap labor and generous government subsidies, plus its Darwinian exploitation of other corporations and public infrastructure, make it kind of amazing and completely evil. The day that Amazon Go launched, those would be the grocery stores without cashiers, it was estimated that Jeff Bezos gained $2.5 billion in personal valuation. If you combine the daily earnings of every cashier in America, you get $281 million. So in one day, Jeff gained 10 times what those jobs actually cost. Now obviously, that jump in valuation is a bit front-loaded. He's not going to see a $2.5 billion gain every single day that Amazon Go exists. Nonetheless, one would be hard-pressed to believe that he worked 10 times harder than the 3.4 million cashiers on that one day. And perhaps Amazon is the perfect confluence of these trends: automation and profit-motivated thinking. The only solution to this natural dysfunction is to reassert the people's voice over their data. If the people are to have a voice in the market, then the form of that voice must be the government. Government must not only enact regulation that protects privacy and civil rights, but it needs to limit the exploitation of big data. It needs to optimize systems to comprehend that cache of information, to treat the productive and creative output as the common legacy that it is. We see in the algorithms and the AIs that exist today the same biases that we exhibit. The silicone brain is not immune from our own confirmation bias. While redlining is no longer an active policy, we are drawing deeper but subtler lines of demarcation between haves and have-nots. Left to private hands, these tendencies are not defective, but rather function to create more surplus value, to generate artificial competition amongst consumers and drive greater inequality. In the march of gentrification, we see the cycle of exclusion, adaptation, exploitation, and finally displacement. Along these lines, planned obsolescence is one of the strangest dances of late capitalism. The blend of desire and function and marketing budgets, this trend is made all the more potent by the emerging legal idea that you don't actually own your stuff. You're merely a leasee with a license to use the corporation's object. How much of your life is on your phone? How accurate a picture of your life could we paint with that data? A good enough picture that our government is currently investing untold billions of dollars a year to create the infrastructure to extract and weaponize that data. We track SIM cards and use Hellfire missiles to obliterate families in other nations, and at Standing Rock we saw how injurious this trend will be here. Private contractors like Tiger Swan are the tip of the spear of weaponized data collection. What we need to be doing is designing the systems that will design the algorithms and brains of the future. Our shortcomings will lead us to a world of artificial scarcity, of the continued boom and bust. The only difference will be the effectiveness of those at the top extracting value at the expense of the people. It is indisputable that we produce more than we use, and yet people across the globe go without. This is an inefficiency that must be corrected.
Chapter 2: Death to Heteronormativity.
We need to do away with the notion that monogamous heterosexual relationships are the basis of cultural norms. It is fitting that we declare this intention with a sexual political term. All politics is personal, and there isn't anything more personal than who you lie down with. And yet the US, and quite frankly every Western nation, has a history of violently imposing heteronormativity on the population, often based on some halcyon call to a nostalgic fantasy. To not stray too deeply into the past, let me quickly reference the movie Stonewall. Is there any better example of the cultural co-option and financialization of an emancipatory story than the production of this film? Its very being was an act of erasure, removing Marsha P. Johnson and replacing her with a white male lead, as well as the erasure of other activists, tells you so much about the cultural and market need to only allow violence from white hands. Is it too much to say that the film robbed the entirety of the resistance centered around the Stonewall Inn of its emancipatory potential? Of course, but it is not too far to reach to say that this kind of market-friendly erasure has virtually no limit. The need to safely profit, to shave off a razor-thin margin, will consistently be fed by the dominant cultural frameworks. You cannot defang one without defanging the other. Beyond the sexual politics of the situation, I want to frame this as a larger attack on the idea of normativity. In his seminal essay, Normative and Nowhere to Go, Pierre Schlag lays out a critique of the idea of objective legal thought. In a legal sense, we suffer from a delusion of what ought to be and what should be done, and I would expand this to include our new techno-optimism, what can be done. This becomes a closed loop, a self-predictive cycle that leads to the same miserable outcomes which only further beg the same questions. It is a pragmatic framework that is its own reason for being. Played out on a national level, this Ouroboros of interventionist war, exclusionary policy, and bad economic decision-making brings disastrous consequences that reach every corner of the globe. In the, quote, an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Titles 2 and 5 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2018, the very catchy name of the 2018 GOP tax bill, aka $1.5 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest people on the planet, this sense of what ought and what can be done have been taken to extremes. Grover Norquist himself could not have imagined a better outcome. He will have a fantastic burn this year. It is no coincidence that the social welfare programs that will be gutted generally benefit people who find themselves on the wrong side of the binary. Not rich enough, not white enough, not straight enough, not healthy enough, not worthy enough. Our cultural shoulds and oughts have become economically weaponized and create the conditions for multi-generational poverty. They feed the cycles of incarceration that disproportionately affect marginalized, not white, not straight groups. What is lost in this rush to do what should be done, in this drive to create, propagate, and conform to normative behavior, are the actual machinations of power. The system itself is blind to its own defects and inefficiencies. It does not study them, but rather adapts to work around them or make them beneficial, to use them to sharpen the bit that will drill down to hollow out the very notion of justice that it claims as its right, displacing heteronormativity, whiteness, etc. More succinctly, to displace these binaries and render them impotent in the policy process while acknowledging their existence and importance to the political process is a key step in displacing capitalism and rendering its benefits moot. Co-option by the market of subversive elements, subcultures, thinkers, artists, and art is by far the greatest danger to any process that exhibits true emancipatory potential. How far do you have to go to see a Shepard Fairey or a Keith Haring? What billionaires in your city will grant you the privilege of glancing upon their Basquiat? Was it weird that the Dalai Lama wanted you to buy a Mac? Is it any stranger that our president is the host of a reality show? Race, class, and gender are all separate obstacles to emancipatory consciousness and action. Each uniquely constitutes a matrix of oppression, but it is only by locating oneself within the intersections that a conscious understanding of the material conditions of the self is possible. Market forces provide the mask for these systems, creating desire, creating need. These demands on the self preclude the option to deconstruct these binaries. The illusion of the path of least resistance leads through a middle-class fantasy. These lines of ought and should have resulted in extreme imbalance. The economic inequality that is reflected in our media gains momentum and becomes an actual force of change in the culture. A mirror powerful enough to not just distort reflections, but to distort the object itself. And here we see the subject turned into an object to be consumed by itself. It is an odd turn to define oneself by externalities, and yet here we are. Value will always be created. Cultural value does not have a reserve currency, as it were. It is an existence unto itself. But our distorted lens of legal and moral frameworks has broken the processes by which we produce and distribute all value. Without dismantling the market forces that drive profit and capital to exploit anything of value, there cannot be a truly emancipatory movement. Likewise, without dismantling the normative frameworks, it will be impossible to move beyond this stage of capital. They are co-productive elements, and as such, must be dismantled together.
Chapter 3. The Bounty of the Universe.
To quote a rather stupid phrase, there is no planet B. To put it more sensibly, the idea that we can run a multi-billion person society by extracting resources indefinitely from this planet was always destined to fail. Perhaps the most twisted aspect of late capitalism can be summed up thusly. We currently have 4-year-olds mining cobalt in slave labor conditions in the Congo, but once somebody invents a robot that can mine more efficiently, that child is out of a job, and we have no backstop. Again, we see here the collective wealth of the planet, perhaps by extension the collective wealth of humanity, appropriated by private interests. What we have here on Earth is a trivial quantity compared to the bounty of our solar system. The furnaces of creation explode, seeding the universe with all the heavy elements that we find so useful. Gold and iron and selenium and lithium and cobalt and nickel and, well, you know, everything. Massive deadly industries ring the globe extracting this literal value from the planet. Look at the disaster that is our environment, as our president crows about mythical alchemical creations like clean coal. And then couple that with a fundamental understanding of the inequality that this has created. In the general sense between the global north and the global south, but even within advanced nations, as the cartels that control resource extraction wield enormous power with an almost assuredly authoritarian tilt. This pattern cannot be repeated on a solar scale, but we already see the seeds of this privatization of space. Example 1, Elon Musk. Now, there are many things to be said about Mr. Musk and his projects, but for the time being, I'll keep myself focused on SpaceX and ignore the flamethrowers. SpaceX is doing the unbelievable on a nearly weekly basis now. It has achieved a consistent record of launches and retrievals, put a car into orbit for no particularly good reason, and provided an incubator for continued innovation. But all of this progress is for a very simple and small-minded goal. Instead of SpaceX providing an opening for humanity's exploration of the cosmos, our ability to produce from near-infinite resources, we are seeing these capabilities restricted only to the ultra-wealthy corporations and state-level actors that can afford the service, as well as the research, development, and construction of satellite projects in the first place. What we do have in the way of shared resources currently in orbit is most visibly constituted in the International Space Station. The ISS is part of our collective legacy, but demarcated along national lines stemming from Cold War antagonisms. The ISS has been a beacon for the idea that national boundaries and ideological differences can be overcome in the name of human progress. But recently, President Trump floated the idea of ending US support and forcing the ISS to raise funds on the private market. And yes, I will cop to the fact that I get sentimental thinking about this. It is very childlike because the observation is so damned obvious that it seems silly to even notice it. And yet that sort of naivete becomes revolutionary in this sense. If we extrapolate out not too far, we quickly come to see that the ability to mine asteroids or other planetary bodies will soon be within reach. The urgent question becomes, who will own the bounty of the solar system? Will the quintillions of dollars of resources be owned by the most powerful few? Or will we seize this opportunity to force our technology to actually serve humanity? And abundance is only meaningful if it benefits everyone. The untapped reserves that are floating just beyond our reach can usher in a new period of growth and production. Without proper systematic planning and valuation, there is no way to correct the distortions that have led to our current unbalanced market. These inequalities will reverberate out and cause greater distortion. Over time, inequality will become sharper and more pronounced, despite the abundance. Even before we reach for the stars, though, it is important to note that there are changes in our consumption that can extend our sustainability and quell our thirst for dwindling resources.
Chapter 4. You don't have to be poor anymore.
Why is it that we associate environmentally friendly design with wealth? Why is sustainability more costly than consumption? Why is green always more green? Isn't it a fascinating turn that the technologies that would allow us to maintain a reasonable modern standard of living are kept just out of reach of most consumers? And it isn't just price or access to technology. There is an entire industry here in the US to write legislation to disincentivize and disrupt the adoption of renewable energy and sustainable processes. Florida has passed legislation that effectively charges a consumer for installing and using solar power. What does this fee do? Why, it goes to compensate the power monopoly that will lose business because of all the free sun in Florida. Other places we see resistance to upgrading power networks to allow solar customers to sell their extra power, to inject it into the grid and lower the costs for everyone. Is it strange that in contemporary America we see access to something as fundamental as electricity as a privilege and not a right? That you can have your access to appliances, heat, and light shut off because of the false scarcity of power generation? Private capital, and especially private monopolies, are inherently conservative and reactionary. If the goal of an employee is to exponentially increase their productive output until death or retirement, whichever comes first, and one of them seems to be coming more quickly than it used to, the goal of these monopolies is to restrict productive output to ensure their own profitable survival. Renewable energy and a devolved grid are fantastic solutions to the problems of growing cities. They would not only begin to curtail some of the harms of the fossil fuel-based economy, but they would also allow for greater density, a better locus of people with fewer restrictions on their productive and creative potential. Technological advances must be used to make the burdens on everyone lighter, not to provide luxury to those at the top, not to ensure the survival of privately held monopolies, not to drive gentrification and greenwashing. And here we get to the meat of the issue: private ownership of property. America is a nation of renters. Urban cities like Los Angeles and New York are supermajority renters. Despite the 2008 crash, the ownership of property of a home is harder to achieve than ever before. Instead of using the bailout cash to fund loans for small businesses and individuals, the large financial institutions bought back their own stock and government bonds. When they crashed the economy, we effectively gave them a zero-interest loan, which they immediately put into small but safe vehicles. We gave them free money to lubricate the gears of capital, and they used it to pay themselves 2% annually. While the banks were busy licking their wounds, large capital firms like Blackstone swept in to buy up newly empty housing stock at a steep discount. The biggest landlords in America are now multinational corporations. They have no vested interest in the communities they own or in keeping up the properties. All that matters is the quarterly return, and that is best served by ruthlessly evicting tenants and raising rents across entire towns. Think about what a strange thing it is that you could live somewhere for 20 years, always pay your rent on time, never run afoul of the lease, and yet still be thrown out of your home by men with guns, because that's what we're talking about when we talk eviction. Sheriff's deputies with guns who are there to compel you to leave. Most residents will never get to that step though. Instead, they will find that gentrification and redevelopment are enforced outside the home. People who have made the community their home are left without legal recourse because their safety, well-being, and right to housing is not recognized as withstanding the challenge of capital. Without securing housing as a human right, there can be no path forward. Los Angeles has an estimated 60,000 houseless people. While billions of dollars will be poured into housing and transition services, we know that it will not be enough. More and more, the people who end up caught out on the street are those that would have been considered, quote, normal. They're not suffering from mental illness or serious drug addiction. Instead, they have found themselves as economic refuse, too old to effectively compete in the labor force, but far too poor to retire. We have no stopgaps, and what means-tested support we do offer is laden with traps meant to disqualify applicants. Our mass incarceral state feeds off this cycle, as being houseless will inevitably lead to run-ins with the police, because that is what the police are there to do. They're there to enforce inequality, to drive out or lock up those not sufficiently wealthy enough to effectively compete in a financialized market. After Hurricane Maria, there was a stark difference between the recovery in Cuba and the lack of recovery in Puerto Rico. Cuba was able to invest directly into repairing damage and restoring services. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico was humbled by the accumulated damage of a decade of austerity imposed on the citizens by private capital. Generous tax policies make Puerto Rico a place to stash money, but what profit is extracted only returns to the island in the form of mega mansions and walled-off neighborhoods of billionaires. Or worst of all possible worlds, a techno-utopia of cryptocurrency colonialists there to privatize the public wealth to feed their fevered dreams of smart contracts that free them from the burden of paying for roads or vaccines or mental health centers, all those things that would make the techno-utopian dream obsolete. But what are we to make of this? The path forward here is clear. Each person has the right to a home, the right to security, the access to renewable energy sources and mass communication. Development must no longer be guided by the notions of capital. When we talk about housing, too often we find ourselves trapped trying to eke out affordable or low-income housing, and this demand is translated into substandard housing that is built to be shameful to the inhabitants. We need to break out of the classist assumptions of housing to imagine a future where the ability to live and remain connected to society at large is assured.
Chapter 5, wherein Jeremy Corbyn yells nationalized and a bird.
And finally, we arrive at the fundamental challenge: communism. As things stand now, global climate change will be the most impactful event of the Anthropocene. By 2050, hundreds of millions of people will be displaced by rising sea levels. Where will these people live? How will they eat? How will they educate themselves? How will they provide the love and support of a community? What we see now under global capitalism is a bleak future of fewer haves exploiting ever more desperate have-nots. In the micro-politics of retail and the get-me-a-manager attitude, and in the macro-politics of the global North's exploitation of the global South, the system is tainted and imbalanced. It lacks a firm center as anchor. The balance of nation-states that has been regarded as the norm has completely broken down and now finds itself entrenched further into the worst qualities of empire. Squeezed by its own productive overreach, the answer is to wall off and hoard rather than leverage technology to efficiently distribute value. And that is ultimately what we are talking about here. The trap we want to avoid is to reduce the value of production and creativity to concrete value attached to money. In order to survive the global crises that humanity has initiated, we must be bold enough to move beyond the monetary value of any goods being worth more than a human life. And this is not just to say their physical life, but the right to participate in community, to exercise agency, to be heard, and to be secure. If you trace back far enough into humanity's past, you come to learn about Göbekli Tepe. Over 12,000 years ago, humanity came together to build its first temple in what is now modern Turkey. It is being argued by some archaeologists that one of the pillars at this site shows a comet strike that may have started a global cooling trend. This drastic change in climate may have been what drove humans farther south and forced them to band together to survive. Early on in our history, we came together as a species to build places like the city of Jericho. And now it is time to return to those roots. Faced with global crises, we must employ global solutions. Whether we meet the Paris Accord goals or not, there is no staving off the rising seas entirely, nor can we remove all the plastic from the oceans, nor the heavy metals from our lungs. The only viable solution to these crises is the strengthening of the public voice and the decommodification of society. The robots that we teach to fish must fish for all of humanity. Going back to the trees or devolving administrative power at this point in history would be foolish. The future of humanity can only be defended by boldly seizing the reins of power in order to facilitate a global redistribution of value and productive capacity. The call to fully automated gay-space luxury communism is not a naive dream or the ramblings of Tumblr, but rather the efficient and mimetic phrasing of the hopes and dreams of the planet. We are a younger and browner planet than the demographics of power would lead you to believe, and yet we see the most drastic fall-off in quality and length of life among these younger generations. The consolidation of global wealth into a few hands facilitated by the illusory boundaries of nation-state power is a disastrous path for the planet's ecosystems in general and our species specifically. So what constitutes this project in the immediate political sense? Nationalized healthcare, rent control and affordable housing mandates, accessible planning and design, nationalization of big data, nationalization of space exploration, disarmament and the eventual disbanding of the police, abolition of prisons, curtailing the U.S. imperial military project, mandated living wages, guaranteed retirement, a universal basic income, guaranteed education, and an aggressively progressive taxation system to recapture the value that has been siphoned off to the top 1%. The time is now to radically intervene in the workings of government. Not through force or violence, but through sustained civic engagement, coalition building, civil disobedience, and community building. The most radical actions are rooted in radical love for your neighbors. That is the foundation of community. That is the foundation of communism. That we can build for each other, and that makes everyone stronger. And now, on the precipice of global catastrophe, it is no longer that we can, it is that we must. So in solidarity, towards a brighter future, of fully automated, gay, space, luxury, communism. Look, even Marx had to write the manifesto to keep the heating oil stocked. So if you want to help me out with that, throw me a couple of bucks on Patreon, or go listen to some of the stuff that I've published over at Knock. Anyways, thank you very much for your support.